Welcome to the third annual Space Diplomacy Lab Media Roundtable webinar with guest journalists Kristin Fisher and Jatan Mehta. Ms. Fisher is the CNN Space and Defense Correspondent. In this role, she covers everything from NASA and the newly created Space Force to commercial space companies and the advent of space tourism. Mr. Mehta is an independent space exploration writer and author of Moon Monday, a newsletter dedicated to covering lunar exploration developments from around the globe, and of Indian space progress, a monthly report contextualizing the progress of India's increasingly relevant space capabilities in the global arena. The roundtable will be moderated by Dr. Benjamin Schmidt, an astrophysicist at the University of Pennsylvania and a co-founder of the Space Diplomacy Lab. Other panelists from the Space Diplomacy Lab team are Ms. Anna Linville and Ambassador Bob Pearson. Thank you to all the attendees for joining today's event. Please submit your questions to the Q&A function. Dr. Schmidt will introduce the event in terms of content, and we will ask questions on behalf of the attendees in the second half of the program. Thank you very much, and thank you to the Trent Foundation for supporting the Rethinking Diplomacy program and other departments here at Duke. Thank you very much, and Ben.
Well, thank you, Giovanni, and thank you, everyone. I'm so excited to moderate our third media roundtable for the Space Diplomacy Lab for, let's say, 2024-2025. Of course, we've been doing space diplomacy issues with the Rethinking Diplomacy program for many years, but launched this lab a little over 2 years ago, and are just excited to see the growth, the interest, the academic in student interest in particular, but just really exciting the fact that a lot of the things that we're talking about in terms of space diplomacy, and of course, Ambassador Bob Pearson, who's a member of our program, has coined the phrase anticipatory diplomacy, and that's something that we certainly have tried to do as much as possible, look to the horizon, look over the horizon if we can, to the future of where we can address possible conflicts, possible issues, possible regulatory issues, possible geopolitical issues, things like this in space or touching the space domain well before they become issues. But it's funny because if you're a longtime fan of our Space Diplomacy Lab, many of the things we talk about, ultimately, we barely can keep up with because they become, from science fiction to science fact in real time. And this has happened certainly over the past, past 2.5 years or so as we've been focusing on these issues. So today's roundtable, usually we have just one topic that we try to do a deep dive in. But of course, with our annual media roundtable, we try to get insights and maybe the insider scoop from our friends in the media on current and future trends in space policy, the commercialization of space, the role of emerging spacefaring nations, the current moon rush that we certainly see in the headlines, the formation of competing diplomatic alliances in the space domain, certainly the Artemis Accords we've talked a lot about in this series as well. So Kristin and Jatan, I want to start with kind of a lightning round and get some of the headlines out of the way. So first of all, what are your biggest thoughts and trends that you're tracking for 2024-2025? Kristin, we'll go to you, then Jatan.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. This is such a timely moment to have this event. I would have to say that the thing that's been keeping me the most busy right now is Odysseus. Intuitive Machines' lunar lander becoming the first private company to land a spacecraft on the surface of the moon. First US-made spacecraft since the end of the Apollo program. That has just been dominating the headlines for the last week, and I've been thrilled that CNN has done so much with it and done so much coverage of it. That's been really exciting to see. But in terms of what I'm perhaps the most concerned about looking forward over 2024 and 2025, it's two things really. And I guess, it's kind of shocking that when the phrase Russian nukes has been in the headlines so much, I actually can say that's not the thing that I'm most concerned about, even though it has really been driving so many headlines, especially from here in Washington. I'd say the thing that is probably most concerning is what happened just about 24, 36 hours ago, which is this close call between two old satellites, one Russian satellite and a NASA satellite. They came within 20 meters of one another. That is just so ridiculously close. And if they were to hit, there's a company called Leo Labs which tracks this sort of things. And they say it would have increased the amount of debris in low Earth orbit, or LEO, by about 50%. I mean, that is so scary. That could alter for decades our access into space, into LEO, what we can do up there, what our satellites are up there. So as I look ahead, that close call just 24, 36 hours ago, it gives me the willies, and I think it should everybody too.
Absolutely. Jatan?
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me here as well. On my end, I would say that firstly, there's a very exciting update from India. Just a few days ago, the government of India announced the first four astronauts from India who would be part of the Gaganyaan program, which is India's own indigenous spaceflight program for human spaceflight specifically. And two of them will fly on the first Gaganyaan mission, which is targeting end of 2025, but probably will be in 2026. But nevertheless, those will be the first astronauts that India sends on its own capability, using its own indigenous technologies end to end, right? So that's very interesting. And there's a lot of interest there from international partners, including NASA, to see how India evolves its spaceflight capabilities from there on with human spaceflight. And then so there's a lot of potential there for collaboration as well. So that's one thing. And the other thing I would say is just moon missions. I mean, of course, Odysseus has been thoroughly exciting and dramatic through and through, for sure. And at the same time, we are gearing up for a couple of more quick CLIPS missions, tentatively end of year, but they probably will get delayed to 2025. But in any case, exciting nevertheless. So there's one from Intuitive Machines themselves. So that's the Prime 1 drill mission. So it's the second mission that NASA has contracted Intuitive Machines for. And the idea is that they would go to the true extreme South Pole region and drill to sample the water ice and then study it in situ to see what it is actually like, because we do not have any clue. All of our understanding of water ice so far on the moon, which is part of the reason for the moon rush, is based on orbital data. So it would be really crucial to have this, literal ground truth to see what it's really like. And then, of course, there's another CLIPS mission in the form of Viper or Firefly, whoever heads first. So I think, yeah, there's the moon missions, and then there's the Indian Human Spaceflight Program.
Well, very exciting, very exciting. So I guess I'm hearing a mix of conflict and opportunity and things like this. Let's just take a moment here for the audience. Can we get a vibe check from both of you? Are we in for a super exciting and positive and space odyssey sort of year coming up, or is it going to be doom and gloom and space nukes and space debris and what really what can we feel in terms of optimism or not in the space industry and global space economy? Kristin, first over to you.
I mean, I think as somebody who has covered politics for many, many years, one of the things I love the most about covering space is how optimistic it is. So I'm team optimist over here. I think what Intuitive Machines has just done, NASA's public-private partnership model is incredibly exciting. But I also think that what could be seen as perhaps the negative, more the doom and gloom, the competition, particularly with China. I was talking to the CEO of Intuitive Machines, Steve Altimus, just before Odysseus's launch, and I asked him about that, and he said, that he was really grateful for the competition. He thought it was a really good thing because it was fueling legislators to fund programs like Artemis and to make the CLIPS program happen. And so while there definitely is competition, Russia making that very clear, or should I say Chairman Turner on the Hill, making that very clear with the statement that he put out, alerting everybody about this Russian threat. I think there's also great opportunity in those kinds of things. So I'm team optimist. That's my vibe check.
Okay, vibe check, team optimist. Jatan, are we going to be in agreement, or are you going to be team pessimist?
Uh, yeah, I think I largely agree, but I think my point of view would be is that I covered a lot of international collaboration as part of my newsletters that you mentioned earlier, and also in the other articles that I write for publications. And the one thing I am very optimistic about is that these days we are seeing more collaboration than ever before. Like on every scale, you have things like the South Korea KPLO, their first lunar orbiter, in which NASA played a very significant role in various ways with mission design help, but also an instrument flying on the orbiter and it launching on the Falcon 9 via the commercial model. So a mix of everything, pretty crazy. But you also had iSpace Japan carrying UAE's Rashid rover to the moon. Of course, the mission unfortunately failed, but nevertheless, it was a good sign of commercial collaboration from UAE is a country that does not have indigenous spaceflight capabilities yet. If they can build a rover, they can fly to the moon on these commercial or semi-commercial missions. So that's exciting. And then there's of course India-US collaborations, the biggest of which is at the moment is NISAR. So it's an Earth observation satellite wherein it's truly a joint half mission from ISRO and NASA, where it's going to be launched around mid-year this year. And it's I think about a $1.5 billion project. So it's probably in the leagues of one of the most expensive EO satellites, which is very important because we want to understand climate change better and we want to be able to act faster. So I think this is the sort of collaboration that's super important. But at the same time, I am concerned about the narratives, right? Because a lot of the narratives often swing people away from collaboration. And it's always, for example, if there's a potential, let's say, collaboration between China and a Southeast Asian country, right? So that sort of a collaboration is not exactly encouraged, right? And so what I fear is that if we project this onto the lunar surface, where we have all of these missions trying to mostly go in a relatively small region at the South Pole, where there's supposedly a lot of water ice, you could see some of these issues start to scale up, and then if not convert into conflict, but certainly into a lot of unfriendliness that could be impacting everyone badly, because it's going to be expensive. Artemis is super expensive. NASA may not be able to keep up that that pace for long enough, especially with the budgets these days. So I think it's really important to maintain the collaboration with a good narrative. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to put you down both for kind of optimistic, super excited nonetheless. And the excitement, I think, is also shared when we talk to our students. We had an astronaut speak at Duke University last fall, super packed house, very exciting questions, but also just the general public's continued entertainment, if not anything else, wonder of the fact that we have so many different lunar missions that have been going on. Obviously, Jatan, India had its Chandrayaan-3 major success last August, becoming the 4th country to land on the surface of the moon. We had Kristin, your nonstop coverage of the ODI mission, the Intuitive Machines mission, which was definitely successful, even though it toppled a little bit on its landing. But we also saw Russia attempt to land Luna 25 and land an unmanned spacecraft for the first time in many decades, which was a failure and led to speculation of whether maybe sanctions were to blame or things like this. I always tell folks, and I think it's shared across the space community, space is hard. So it's hard to always, look at successes or failures in terms of raw geopolitics, but nevertheless, people do it. And I guess what I'd like to ask you, the last question of our lightning round, is what are you most excited about in terms of a specific mission or technology that are coming up in the next, let's say, 1 to 2 years? No real hard cap on that timeline, but often the space media knows these missions and these technologies are going to be tested coming up well before we're back here writing think pieces about this, so we don't see these. So what do we have in store? What should we be excited about coming up?
I mean, for me, it's Starship. I mean, of all the launches that are coming up, that one vehicle overwhelmingly has the greatest potential to completely revolutionize and transform humanity in space and what we can do in space. They've had 2 test flights. Just a few days ago, the FAA closed the mishap investigation on the second one, so they're getting ready for their 3rd test flight in Boca Chica. And there's just so much that hinges on it, right? I mean, just from getting that much mass into space, what you can do with that, that's revolutionary all by itself. But there's also so much riding on that vehicle. You have NASA's flagship human spaceflight program, Artemis, and the Artemis astronauts completely reliant on that vehicle in order to make Artemis 3 happen, the first crewed lunar landing since the Apollo program. And so I think you have a lot of people eyeing it with excitement, but also some real nervousness, because as of now, there is no backup plan. There's no redundancy built in to Artemis 3. You can see NASA starting to not get nervous, but just want that redundancy built into the mission. So they go out to Blue Origin and have contracted with Blue Origin to build their own human version of a lunar lander. So I think there's a lot of excitement around that. I, for one, got to see my first Starship launch back in November, and it lives up to the hype, but also a lot of nerves that we're now at this point where they've got to get this right. And not only do they have to get this thing into orbit, but they also have to do an unknown number of fuel transfers in orbit. And top SpaceX official was really pressed by this on a media call recently and kind of dodged the question. And you had Bill Nelson, the NASA administrator, jump on and say, whoa, actually, could you answer that question for us? And she put it at 11. So 11, that's just, how you get there and make that in time to Artemis 3. Obviously, I'd never bet against SpaceX by any means. They've proven they can do the impossible, but it's a lot to get done.
Sorry, 11 fuel transfers?
11 fuel transfers.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
11.
All right, got it. Okay, the bar is high. Jatan.
Yeah.
I think my point of excitement in the next few years is on a related topic, again with the moon, but on the very specific point of water ice. So the thing is that if you read a lot of the coverage, and not just the coverage, but also the general public understanding of water ice on the moon and why everyone is racing, and I put the word racing in quotes, racing to the moon in the rush of water ice. But the thing is that the picture is not as straightforward, right? Firstly, it's we only discovered, actually confirmed water ice in in a little over a decade ago with the Chandrayaan-1 mission, and it was specifically the 2 NASA instruments on board Chandrayaan-1 which confirmed water ice. It was a fantastic example of collaboration. Nevertheless, the point being that that's only when we confirmed water ice, but because of the limiting resolution of orbital data, inherent limits to orbital data, you do not really know as to the finer scale availability of water ice on the moon's poles. And not just that, you also do not know as to what form is it in, right? What kind of chemical form is it in? What is the physical state of it? Is it mixed with regolith? Is it in some other, form of ice sheets or whatever else, or some mix of all of these things, right? So the thing is that for this, and obviously, scientists know this, it's not like they are not aware. They are the ones who are leading this charge. So there are quite a few missions from both NASA and ISRO in Japan that are trying to do this first step, very critical step. So there's, of course, I mentioned the second intuitive machine Scripps flight with Prime 1, but there's also Viper, which is NASA's rover, upcoming rover. and it will go inside these some of these permanently shadowed regions on the moon's south pole where the water ice is known to be present, but we don't know exactly where. And then it will go and hunt for this water ice and then try to dig up the soil, drill up to 1 meters or so, and then the soil that it scoops out, it will try to study using a bunch of spectrometers, and then we'll really know what the ice is like, and how much energy and technology we would need to actually utilize it when we hope to send astronauts in the future, including on Starship for long-term living and all that good stuff, right? So that's one. But there's also parallelly the ISRO JAXA LUPEX mission, which has a similar goal to Viper. But the interesting thing is both of these are carrying mostly complementary instruments, right? So for example, the Viper rover has a neutron spectrometer, which can give you hints of hydrogen as an indirect hint of water ice, up to a meter or so below the surface. So as Viper is slowly, treading the surface of the lunar south pole, it will try to make a sort of a map of the potential water ice sheets beneath the surface. And likewise, the LUPEX rover, which is a ISRO JAXA mission, it will have a sort of a deep penetrating radar, which will tell you about potential water ice sheets a few meters beneath the surface. So in that sense, these are very complementary missions, and both of them will tell you about the nature of water ice using some common suites of spectrometers, right? So, and the interesting thing is that both of these, like all of these countries, are signees of the Artemis Accords, right? So India, US, Japan, and US have all signed the Artemis Accords, and so there can be expected to be a general data sharing of these missions between the countries and also with other countries potentially part of the Accords. So I think this will be really crucial to get right, because if we do not have a good grasp on the nature and abundance of water ice on the moon, none of what we are planning would really make any sense without the science backing it up. And so we'll get to know that like in 3-4 years.
Okay, 3-4 years. All right, so we're looking at some really exciting headlines coming up, obviously, and that gives us here at the Space Diplomacy Lab a good ladder of the kind of bars that we need to keep in mind as we do our diplomatic analysis. So moving from the lightning round into kind of our thematic questions, I'm going to ask a question, then I'll go to Ambassador Pearson, Anna, and Giovanni to each ask questions. I just want to remind our audience, please enter questions in the Q&A feature. Later in this conversation, we'll hope to get some of your questions answered as well. But I would be remiss as we talk more and more about the impact of space exploration, space militarization, which we're trying to avoid here at the Space Diplomacy Lab, obviously, space competition, strategic competition in space, all of these sort of issue sets. I'd be remiss, now that we're in our third media roundtable, that space media itself has a big role to play in how the international community understands space missions, understands the stakes and the various players, when it comes to things like anti-satellite weapons testing, that we've talked about previous in or trying to get further banned. Attribution is key, just like critical infrastructure protection on the Earth. Attribution is key. And I'll just say this is the first time we were noticing your Kristin, your Saturn over your shoulder that you have there. You also have an Emmy, so clearly space media is for both of you. You're prolific writers, speakers, interviewers, and anchors on these sort of issues. What can you say about the role space media itself can play in international diplomacy?
I'm so glad you asked that. It's a great question. It's something I think about a lot. Two points there that I'd like to make. The first is that, so much of what I think our job is as space communicators and journalists is education, because so much of the public does not speak this language at all. And I kind of find myself in the unique position where I'm not a Jeff Faust speaking to a very, space savvy audience. I'm speaking to a very broad mainstream media audience. And I, for a while, would get very frustrated by the fact that my stories felt like I'd write a lead and then the rest of the piece was all like an explanation. And it didn't feel like journalism, it felt like education. And I was like, I'm wasting so many words explaining things. But I'm now at a point where I think that's just where we are. And I see that responsibility of just educating people who aren't very familiar with space as one of the most important things that I do as a space journalist. And not just with the lingo, but also, perfect example, what is ODI? Is it a success or a failure? I think that for so many people, they heard, oh, it tipped over, and oh, we didn't get pictures. For so many members of the public and even some people that I work with to label it a failure. And I immediately found myself in the position of really trying to explain why the mission, yes, there are some elements that didn't work and failed, but overall this is a success and here's why. So that nuance there is really, really important. And I find myself that need to sort of translate it absolutely critical right about now.
Absolutely. Jatan?
I think I'd like to build on Kristin's excellent answer on the education aspect of space journalism, right? Because if you really think about, so I care a lot about moon exploration in particular, and so if you really think about it, what are the reasons that people should explore the moon? There are many, right? There's scientific. I will not go into all of the reasons, but broadly speaking, there's many scientific reasons to explore the moon because it teaches us about not just its own history, but the history of Earth that is so tied to it, right? So the origin of Earth and the evolution of Earth is very much tied to the moon, as is the origin and evolution of the solar system in many ways, right? So we learned about the key eras in the evolution of the solar system, such as the heavy bombardment period of asteroids, because of our Apollo missions and other missions telling us that there was there's this record in the lunar soil that's completely transparently telling us what happened in the early solar system in ways that no other body can teach us that. That's one, but there's also technological progress, like the moon is an excellent stepping stone to not just Mars, but also deep space in general, from many perspectives, from lunar landing tech perspectives to radiation, deep space radiation perspectives, and so on and so forth, right? But the thing is that because of the fairly limited coverage that in general the media at large tends to have, at least certainly here in India, most of the people only care about one aspect of going to the moon or the other aspect of going to the moon. So I think it's the job of not just the educators and the schools and so on, but also the job of the journalists who are the ones being read and seen day to day about events happening in real time, to convey why there is a need to explore space, why there's a need to explore the moon. And ultimately that plays into policy as well, in my opinion, because public policy is ultimately shaped by people in power, right? And people in power need to be aware of why we are doing certain things, and definitely why we are not doing certain things, right? So that's one aspect. But at the same time, I also believe maybe I'll expand on the previous part a little bit, because if you look at Apollo, right, amazing achievement to land humans on the moon for the first time ever, pretty incredible. However, even the very country who landed humans on the moon could not sustain that program and could not revive it for 50 years. And I don't mean this as a negative commentary. I mean this as a reality check as to if we really want to do go back to the moon sustainably, we need to think broader with more better sustained public support, right? So we need mechanisms that are more sustainable, and that is what we will get out of educating the public. And with that, I will move on to the second bit, which is I really believe in the power of investigative journalism as well, because our job is not just to be mostly simplified relayers of what the scientists and engineers do, because there are obviously all sorts of elements, geopolitical elements and policy elements and all the other things, historical elements to spaceflight, that cultural elements that need to be considered, right? So I think, especially in my country, where ISRO is not as forthcoming with their outreach and updates as NASA is, right? So I have grown up reading more about NASA stories than I've grown up reading about ISRO stories, even though I'm here in India, right? And I think in some sense it's really sad. It's great to have the NASA stories, but it's also sad to not have the ISRO stories, right? So I think from that perspective, when something goes wrong, ISRO has this habit of sort of not being very transparent about things. And so that is when the journalists can really do their job of prodding and trying to get the story out and trying to get the truth out, because at the end of the day, it's taxpayers' money and we do need justification for it, right? And that's where education will also help, because if you educate the people, they will understand the risks of spaceflight, and then they will probably accept failure in better ways.
Well, thank you. And I, especially given the amount that we're focused on education here in the Space Diplomacy Lab with Duke, and of course I'm teaching here at Penn as well. I get questions about space and space policy quite often. One of the things that I'm glad that both of you in your reporting and all the moon missions that are going on near the South Pole are doing is explaining why, just like you did earlier, Jatan, the why we care about finding water ice, frozen on the lunar surface, because I've heard questions from folks that ask, well, heck, we got a hell of a lot of water here on Earth. Why do we have to go to the moon to get more water? That's not the point, clearly. So, an educational mission, a public policy mission, informing and educating policymakers, and then as you've both pointed out, the kind of investigative journalists and getting the inside information on what's really going on, pro or con, in any of these missions, so important, and important to us as we do our research. I'm going to go to Ambassador Bob Pearson next for his question, and we'll go Kristin and Jatan. Ambassador, you're muted.
Thank you very much for a really exciting presentation of facts and possibilities. And I think that you and we all share the excitement of space and the adventurous spirit of space. And I hope that stays with this issue indefinitely. I am a diplomat. I spent my life coming to grips with problems that already existed, and they were knotty, and they take long years to solve. Arms control took 10 years to resolve. The Outer Space Treaty took 10 years or so to resolve. The Law of the Sea Treaty took more than 10 years to resolve. So what I'm worried about, however, are two things that you mentioned. One is the space debris issue, which I think is, of course, at an urgent level. And Kristin's explanation is a perfect example of what just happened. And the other one is exploitation of resources on the moon. To begin with, as a student of Western Hemisphere history, I know what happens when you have unconstrained competition between powerful states. And what happens in space happens on Earth. So what I would like to know, Ben and I wrote a column several years ago about the need to think about a space summit. So we have summits on all kinds of issues, the G7, G20, G77, the UN. But to put this question in its most difficult form for you, I would like to know, why would we not have a space summit, and how would we frame it? And to that second point, the G7 doesn't include China or Russia. The G20 includes Russia and China, but they're not using that as a forum for solving problems at this point. The climate control process first created a framework. It took a long time to do it, a framework, and then they begin to parse out the problems and solve them. So is that a better way to approach this issue, to form a framework of issues internationally that isn't under the control of a particular organization and see what we can do? So that's what I'm not going to take away from any of your optimism, but I am going to say that this is a problem that is going to grow, and problems that grow without resolutions get worse. So help me to understand, why would you not have a space summit? And if so, how would you do it?
Big question you've been asking. Kristin, over to you.
Oh goodness, Ambassador, that's a tough question. And I actually feel like you're much better qualified to answer it than me. Why do we not have one yet? I mean, I think for similar reasons of why it took us so long to get a Space Force. I think people have always kind of, you view space as an extension of the Air Force or an extension of other things, as opposed to its own unique domain with its own unique sets of issues. I think the time is past ripe for something like that. I guess the question becomes, how do you get all of the pertinent players to the table when you're dealing with all of the major space powers of the world? But as you said, Ambassador, I mean, it's been done before. It's time to do it again. And I just look at what has happened over the last few weeks with this, all the headlines about Russian nuclear weapons in space, and you look at what Secretary of State Antony Blinken was doing at the Munich Security Conference. This was a few days after the news broke about what it was, and he was openly talking about going to the Chinese and the Indians and saying, look, if we can't talk sense into Russia about not deploying a nuclear EMP, perhaps you can. So obviously that kind of diplomacy, I think, is absolutely critical, and we need more of it. And just one more note on that whole storyline, and it kind of ties into what we were just talking about the role of space journalists. I kind of found myself in this really unique position, and I was on this, I was part of the reporting team that broke the story of what it actually was, a nuclear EMP. And through that process, it was fascinating to me. It took several days for us to figure out what exactly was the threat that Chairman Turner was talking about. And even when we did, it took several days of going back and forth with our sources to make sure we knew exactly what it was. And the reason it took so long, we later figured out, was because a lot of the intelligence journalists whose sources in the intelligence community had actually seen this intelligence that Turner was talking about, they didn't speak space as fluently as perhaps they should have. Whereas my sources in the space industry spoke it fluently, but they hadn't seen the actual intelligence. So it took a tremendous amount of going back and forth with taking the intel that the intelligence reporter had, taking it to my sources, doing that translation. Going to be a real a growing thing to think about going forward, is not just educating the public, but also the policymakers, and perhaps they could attend a school just like yours. But I've been noticing that become an increasing issue as we get to more of these national security stories on Capitol Hill that involve space.
Well, thanks, Kristin. And I will just shamelessly plug the fact that this lab has called, in the Rethinking Diplomacy program, has called for more scientists and technologists directly in the room. Not a nice to have, but a must have in the foreign policy, national security, and intelligence process. So I think you've given us a real world example of why what we're calling for has been so needed. Jatan.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that, it's a really tough question. And I think, again, as Kristin said, Ambassador, you are much well suited to answer this. But what I will do is give my perspective on why I think, it's important to open the channels of communication within the scientific community as well, which are currently not that open. So, for example, the ambassador mentioned waterized resources on the moon potentially becoming a problem in the future, right? And I think that's a genuine concern, because let's say if we do, after these string of missions that try to figure out the exact state of water ice, and China has their own set of them, other than the ones that we already discussed, they after this happens, and let's assume that we really do have sufficient water ice on the moon that is desirable for future exploration missions, and then all of these countries try to target a very small region on the moon. But the thing here to remember would be that this is this sort of a this sort of a timeline playing out would escalate very quickly if people who cover it, and if people who are into the narratives and the policy making, do not understand the science of it. For example, I had seen several stories recently where it said something of the sort where the headline read that China selects the same landing regions as Artemis 3, right? And I would try to break down that headline a bit without naming the publications, because it's the original problem that I'm targeting, which is firstly the Artemis 3 candidate sites are 13, and at 13 we cannot really say that these are site selections as much as much as we can say that they are potential candidate sites. So that's one. So the second thing is, which is completely on a technical level, and I say this as someone coming from a country who does not have good relations with China either. So India does not historically have a good relations with China, but yet in this particular case, the headline was misleading, because if you look at the terrain of the South Pole, um, it's a very rocky terrain, and you have barely any, you have barely patches a few hundred meters across at best that are smooth-ish. Still many boulders, still rocky, and still some slopes, but relative to the extremely rocky terrain at large, you only have like a few hundred meters of smooth terrain, which means the landers must target descending on those areas. Otherwise, they will face the unfortunate hard landings that OD has faced recently, right? So that's one. The second thing is that because and I'll connect it to the original question, just bear with me for a moment. Because the sun is always perpetually like near the horizon on the lunar poles, because the lunar axis is perpendicular to the sun's plane. So which means that there are only some elevated areas on the poles that receive sunlight. Everything else is in either permanent darkness or frequent periods of darkness, right? So if you just do a simple landing site analysis for where you should send a lander, regardless of which country you are from, you would probably end up picking one of these few handful of sites, because they are the only one that make any engineering sense, right? So what I'm trying to say is that when these missions eventually go there and they try to target these handful of relatively small regions, it's important to keep in mind that not all of those decisions are taken with the geopolitical adversary in mind, right? Some of them are purely engineering, but this you would only understand if you have these scientists and engineers about talking to each other and cross-connecting with each other, which is where I think that the US should use India's communication lines to Russia, because India and Russia have had a long-standing partnership, not just in space but also defense in general. And most recently, although the tides have turned and Indian-US collaboration has been at an all-time high, and that's also fantastic. But at the same time, the Russian-Indian ties have not broken completely either. So I would say that it would be paramount for the US to use these channels that are available to try to calm things a little bit. On the other hand, I also see there's a possibility between the US, China itself with regards to the moon to make some things work. For example, most recently, I'm not sure exactly when, but a couple of months ago at least, there was this exception made to the Wolf Amendment, where NASA sought an exception to study the Chang'e 5 samples that China had gotten from the moon, right? And usually these collaborations are not allowed because the Wolf Amendment does not allow the US and Chinese researchers to collaborate unless there's an exception made, right? So NASA, on behalf of the US scientific community, did seek that exception and they got it. And so now the US scientists can apply to study the Changi 5 samples. So of course, this is not like this is just a start, but I think this is one development that should be built upon to try to answer some of these things that the ambassador has raised.
Well, thank you very much for both your answers. I see that direct collaboration and exchange of information at the scientific level, which is something we strongly support, as Ben said, is one good way to help frame an atmosphere. That happened in climate change as well. But eventually, as I think you both acknowledge, we are going to have a governance mechanism for managing these large issues. And so I would just say media plays a invaluable part in forming that recognition, whether you call it explanation or education, so that the world begins to see how important it is to get moving on these problems instead of waiting a half a century as we did on climate control. So thank you very much. I greatly appreciate it.
And I'll just add on that by saying that something that Jatan said, triggered my memory back to how not you both, but some in the media and on social media, I think in particular, which is of course not journalism in any way, shape, or form, tried to make this notion that the Russians in the Indian space agencies were directly racing to the moon in August and September of last year, as if the technical reality wasn't the truth, which was that these missions are planned years and years in advance, and it's by chance that they are happening within a few weeks of each other, not as if they just say, oh, we see the Indians are heading up there, let's throw ours on the launch pad and throw it into space as well. Anyways, Anna, your question.
Thank you again, Kristin, Jatan, for joining us. This has been a really fascinating discussion, and I'm sure we're going to have a lot to chew on in the Rethinking Diplomacy program, Space Diplomacy Lab. We talk a lot in the Rethinking Diplomacy program about the importance of rules and norms in international relations because it's an inherently anarchic system where there is no law really that has any ability to enforce. So really, the international community built its own rules and norms and behavior expectations. What are some of the top rules and norms and behavior expectations you think are needed in the space domain in international relations? And how do we get there?
Well, I think first and foremost, there obviously needs to be an update to the Outer Space Treaty, some kind of weapons treaty or discussion. The story about what Russia has been trying to develop, even though we all know who covered this, that this was not imminent. This was not an imminent, just one of the many types of weapons that that's been kind of percolating in the background. But when you dig into it and you I think most people are shocked that really nothing has happened on that front since 1967. So I think, first and foremost, you got to start there. And then just the space traffic management, the congestion in low Earth orbit in particular, the rise of the mega constellations, and looking at it in terms of both from a security perspective and the potential for collision events, but also from the perspective of astronomists. I think one of my favorite stories that I've done recently was traveling to Saskatchewan, Canada, to a dark sky preserve to just look at how the night sky is changing and the impact that that's having on everyone from your armchair astronomer to the very large observatories to indigenous tribes who view the night sky and the moon in particular as a sacred space. There's no real regulations regarding that. And so it's really, we talk so much about the US government needing to catch up, and it does. But it is, as you say, really a global thing of nations needing to come together to arrive at some consensus, because this, what China does with mega constellations, what SpaceX does, it impacts every one of us.
And as someone who's been working on developing large helping develop large observatories over the years. I definitely agree with that from my astrophysicist hat. But we need that for space policy as well. Jatan.
Yeah, let me just say that I also come from a physics and astrophysics background, so I also agree with both of you guys on that front. And I think Kristin covered everything, basically everything you wanted to say, and then some more. So I will try to add something to that and say that, for example, we need the one thing we would need before even like everyone talks about resources and on the moon and the poles and whatnot, but even before any of that happens, the congestion is likely going to be there in lunar orbit first and foremost, right? Because there are only like unlike Earth orbit, there are only few lunar orbits that make sense from an engineering standpoint because not all orbits are stable. So these are called elliptical frozen orbits in the technical jargon. And then there are some distant orbits which are stable, but they're not very helpful in terms of mapping. So the bottom line, what I'm trying to say is that because all of these missions would need support in terms of orbital mapping and also support things like upcoming GNSS around the moon and so on and so forth. There's only a few orbits around the moon that are really feasible, and so these are the ones that would get crowded soon. And we are already starting to see some small effects of that. It's sort of like a mirror, holding a mirror to all the problems in Earth orbit right now. But here we have the opportunity to actually, do it rightly from the start, right? So even in the last few years, if you follow some of this minor news items on ISRO's and NASA's websites, you would see that there have been a few instances of the NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter and India's Chandrayaan-2 orbiter avoiding a potential collision course by one of them doing a maneuver. Of course, the two teams are talking to each other, but this may not be the case if, let's say, there's a Chinese orbiter and a US orbiter, or even a Chinese orbiter and an Indian orbiter, right? Because so what do you do then, right? So once you have the so-called lunar economy or sustained lunar exploration, these are the kinds of problems that will grow. So one of the mechanisms that we should explore via the Artemis Accords or via the extending the outer space treaty or even resurrecting the moon treaty for whoever cares about it, the few people that would really do, in whatever way to convince all the stakeholders to openly share orbital data just as they do with a lot of the Earth orbit missions, right? So these data sets, if they are available for lunar orbital missions as well, it would go a really long way to just not have that problem in the first place, which we are afflicted with now in Earth orbit.
Thank you. I'll go over to Giovanni.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Very quick question, which is also, it will answer one of the questions from the attendees. Going back to the private sector, since we have been talking about competition among countries or nations, I find that the more I study and we talk to the private actors, let's say, in the space domain, that there is a lot of collaboration. And in fact, that is partially because of the complexity of the technologies and scientific instruments that are needed. But the other is because space is such a harsh environment that they need to collaborate not only on specific projects together, just from a technical point of view, but also because of the security involved in most of the operations. So when we talk about space debris, of course, it's not that if space debris comes from a Russian, American, or Chinese old satellite, the problem is if it's another body, it has a huge impact in whatever it's going to happen. So from your point of view, do you see this collaboration, this particular environment for the private sector going to be sustained in the future? It's just because we are at the beginning of this new era. And connected to this, which is more a practical example, is the space station or space stations that we are going to have in the future. Since the ISS is going to be decommissioned 2030, now they say 2031, now we know that there are several projects for private space stations. One is Axiom with NASA, and that is connected also to the ISS. But there are others on the make. And again, these are already, by these different projects are collaborations among different partners, but they also, they not necessarily are going to compete with the other space stations because they specialize in different activities. So what is your take on the private sector excitement, but also this need to work together, and both in the US, but also internationally? And also, if you can say something about the space station or space stations that you see on the rise.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the space station, because I don't think we can have a conversation about space and diplomacy without talking about the ISS and what it has been able to accomplish over the last 2 decades, especially in the midst of the ongoing war in Ukraine, which is happening right now. I mean, I still can't believe that you have this seat swap agreement between the US and Russia. I mean, that is just a model of diplomacy in action. I think NASA and Roscosmos have done a good job of laying the groundwork and showing a framework for how this could and should continue once the ISS retires. I was at the FAA's commercial spaceflight conference here in DC last week, and one of the panelists was talking about, it was a panel about after the retirement of the ISS, and one of the panelists was talking about how one of the things that they've been most surprised about when it comes to the commercial demand with space stations has been the type of clientele that's interested in what they want. And I think everybody always kind of thought wants to take a selfie and post it on their Instagram feed, but in reality, they're finding that their biggest customers are other governments, from European space agencies, India, countries that, are perhaps partners with NASA, but haven't had the opportunity to fly yet. So Axiom Space really taking up the lead on that for now. But then also what the private paying customers want to do up there. They don't just want to sightsee, they want to actually have an impact and make a difference. And so I think that's something that the commercial sector should really try to harness, is that desire to do good in space. And you even see that within the flyers themselves, the astronauts. We talk about the Wolf Agreement and how the US government and China are forbidden from really interacting in any meaningful way in space. But when you talk to the flyers, the astronauts themselves, or the taikonauts, there's a real level of respect and a real desire to kind of perhaps share more than their governments will let them. And so I think as the commercial sector rises up to really take even more of the reins from the governments than it already has, I think there's a real opportunity here to just continue in the way that the ISS, that example that has been set before them.
Jatan?
Yeah, I think the bringing up India in the context of the human spaceflight is really interesting, because there's multiple things that's happening which directly plays into this question, which is one, as we mentioned before, India is making its own human spaceflight capabilities, and it would be the 4th in the world to do so once that happens. But at the same time, last year, when the Indian Prime Minister visited the US, they made a joint statement on the huge number of things that the US and India would collaborate on in terms of high technology sector areas, and that involves spaceflight as the top level item, right? And that included human spaceflight. And so one of the deals involves an Indian, one of these 4 astronauts that were revealed just a few days ago. They will go on to the International Space Station via one of the mechanisms that NASA has available. That has not been announced yet, but presumably it will be some sort of an Axiom-like deal. That's our best guess as of now. So that mission is slated sometime later this year. And so that will be the first Indian to the Indian space station. But that's just one aspect of it. There's also the other way, the collaboration the other way around, because the question particularly pertains, private partnerships and collaborations, right? So, for example, there was Blue Origin, who has a lot of interest in having their vehicle fly on an Indian rocket as part of their human spaceflight offerings, right? So to expand their human spaceflight offerings. So, for example, they had talks to have India have the Indian rocket, which is called the Launch Vehicle Mark III. That is the rocket that will be used for human spaceflight and for the Gaganyaan program. And so it has a capability to go and dock to their own space station. That same capability can be utilized elsewhere, which is where the future of NASA's, or rather the US's space stations come in. When these commercial orbital destinations come online end of decade, one of them is expected to be from Blue Origin, called the Orbital Reef. And to deliver cargo for that, Blue Origin has asked ISRO if they can launch capsules on their rocket to the orbital reef station. Obviously, these are like talks that are just ongoing yet, and it's not like a set thing yet, because none of these two capabilities exist at the moment. But the point is that this is an indicator of the things to come, right? So you have collaborations at multiple levels. So you have the ISRO-NASA collaboration via Axiom-like channels. You have US commercial companies flying things on the Indian rockets for their own purposes, and then everything in between, right? So that's one aspect. The other aspect which I can think of is that there's also the opening up of the foreign direct investment in India, which is a thing that happened last week. So India recently completely transformed its space policy. It was released in April 2023. That was basically India letting go of space as a national security domain first and foremost. So until now, the Indian space sector did not allow commercial and private players the way the US industry has almost always has, or at least for the last 2 or 3 decades, in a very clear fashion. So that has opened up in India now. And part of that progress involved opening up foreign direct investment in India, which means that as part of these many Indo-US collaborations, you can now expect, US investment in Indian technologies in whatever permutations that are possible. And then you could have things like there's Pixel Space, which is a US registered company, but with a significant Indian presence, but with contracts with both the Indian Air Force and the US Air Force, I believe, or the NRO, one of the two. I'm not sure. I can check and get back, but it's one of the two for sure. So these sorts of companies could not really exist before, like even 5 years ago, right? So I think that's a very significant indicator of the things to come. And lastly, to sort of put the cherry on the top for human spaceflight, is that unfortunately, as amazing as the ISS was, or rather is, I'm sorry, as amazing as the ISS is, unfortunately, the Russian collaboration is not going to last beyond it, because we know that the NASA-led International Gateway Lunar Orbital Habitat does not have Russia as a partner, and there's no plans to onboard them anymore, and there's no will from the other side as well. But it does bring new players apart from the same collaborators as ISS. It brings in the UAE, which of course does not do things on their own per se. They do not have as many indigenous capabilities, but they contract stuff outside. So in this case, I think UAE is going to contract Airbus or some such company to make the airlock for the gateway. So that's one vector for private collaboration, intergovernmental private collaboration. It's very complicated these days, but that's one. And then the other vector is that India is also considering a contribution to the gateway. We are not sure yet as to what that might be, because a lot of the things are already taken up by the other countries. But the one possibility that we do see aligning with our own roadmap to send an Indian to the moon by 2040. Obviously, that's ambitious, but that's the vision. So the one thing that we do see is that because we have had a huge success in putting orbiters around the moon also, not just, landers. The landing aspect is only recent with Chandrayaan-3, but with Chandrayaan-1, 2, and 3, we demonstrated time and again that we could precisely enter things into orbit, and then also with Chandrayaan-3, bring them back. So the propulsion module, which was sitting in lunar orbit, was actually brought back to Earth orbit, which is a very fascinating demonstration of technical prowess. So one of the things India is looking at is the cargo support, cargo delivery support for the gateway, right? Which is something that the gateway would need, because unlike the ISS, it's really far away. The moon is really, really far away, and you better have redundancy there rather than hoping that the astronauts would be able to get by nicely around the moon as they can in ISS, relatively speaking. So I think that's one interesting outcome that we can expect.
Well, thank you
Thank
both. I want to basically we're rapidly running out of time here. So one, maybe 2-sentence answer to this question that you both hinted at in the last intervention, but something I should say is we started this our first event on the Space Diplomacy Lab, which was our media roundtable with folks whose names have been mentioned here, Jeff Faust, for example. But 2 days before, or 2 days after Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine, and clearly we seem to be entering a new era of space in which possibly the NASA Roscosmos relationship will be coming to an end with the end of the International Space Station. So 2 sentences each. Do you think that the US and Russia will kind of reset their relations more in line with how the US and China have it now, which has not had a traditional open collaboration, or will we see something else? Kristin, you first.
I don't think it will stay as it is now. No way. Once the ISS retires, I think that's going to be a big break. But I will say the relationships forged between NASA and Roscosmos are strong, are deep. I mean, the respect between the control room and the Moscow Mission Control Room, those are real relationships that have been built over decades. And I don't think that's going to go away overnight.
Jatan?
Yeah, unfortunately, I too do not think that it will approach anything of the scale that it has been for the last couple of decades, and I think it will deteriorate with time as things stand right now. Unfortunately, so I mean I would be more than happy to be wrong about this, but I don't think that's going to be the case.
Okay, I want to give you both a chance to just last reflections. Usually we just have this very open-ended, but I do want to ask you a very specific question, because journalism, as we know, is so important in diplomacy and understanding global events, having boots on the ground, investigative journalists and folks in war zones and folks in conflict areas and folks in natural disasters. Both of you are space journalists, and I think you know what I might ask next. Who's going to be the first space journalist, and should we have journalists in space as things expand to better, more directly report on geopolitical issues and things just like we have here on Earth? And will you be the one? Both of you, will you be going to space anytime soon? Kristin, you first.
Well, Michael Strahan already took the title of the first journalist in space. It was suborbital, so maybe it didn't fully count, but
did he interview anyone up there? Did he actually interview someone? I mean, going up specifically to do journalism.
I can't speak for ABC. They might say that they did do journalism. I would respectfully disagree. Look, you're right. Every other journalist that covers every other field gets to go to the domain that they cover. So absolutely, sign me up. I'd go. I have a 10-month-old baby right now, so maybe let me get my kids a little bit older, and then I'll do it.
I don't know if there's a mission ready for you anyway, so that might work out well. Jatan, how about you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, more than anything, I would love to have the chance to go to the moon, and maybe even write one of my Moon Mondays from there, and then just beam it down to all of my subscribers from there for sure. Like in situ lunar reporting more than anything else.
Wonderful.
How great would that dateline be? The moon.
Yeah, the
moon. The lunar surface. I mean, that's like, those are the kind of datelines that every journalist dreams of, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, look, very, very exciting. As always, our media roundtable always seems to well exceed our already high expectations. A lot of optimism, a lot to look forward to, and a lot of work for us as space diplomat practitioners to think about as we go forward. Kristin Fisher, Jatan Mehta, thank you so much. This conversation doesn't end here. As always, the Space Diplomacy Lab will continue to have webinars and in-person events as we go forward on a variety of topics throughout the course of 2024 and going into 2025. And we just want to thank you and send off, as we send off every Space Diplomacy Lab event, by saying, keep looking up. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having us. This was a great session, and I learned a lot myself.